Welcome to the Ernie Chambers Show.
Friends, enemies, neutrals, I am going to do something a little different. There are groups and individuals who tried to get me to write a book down through the years, and I have said I'll give it some thought, but I never seriously considered it. I'm the one who tells people who have done something they should write a book. I was telling Carl Washington, who put together the boxing club, that he had done something that had never been done in Omaha before. He had material, trophies, and artifacts from actual heavyweight and different weight boxing champions. They were professionals. A lot of people don't know the work that he did, and I'm telling him this. I told John Beasley, the actor, he ought to do the same thing. Then they'll ask me when I'm going to do it. I said, well, really, I'm not sure. I've got boxes of documents, and having been in the legislature a total of 46 years, a lot of papers have been accumulated, which I never read. I would get them, lay them aside, intending to read them, and never got around to it. So the other day, I was going through a box and I came across some items, and I decided that it's a poor car that won't toot its own horn. And down through the years, people would ask me, what do you do in the legislature? Those who don't like me, and that doesn't bother me. They didn't like Jesus. At least I haven't been crucified yet. Notice I said yet. We don't know what tomorrow may bring. I don't know that when I breathe out, that I'll breathe in again. We don't know those things. All we can do is what we can do in the time that's right this instant. A second from now is the future, and I cannot live there. A second ago is the past, and I cannot go back. That doesn't mean I cannot do the same thing, but I can't go back to that point in time. Once it elapses, it's gone. Where to? I don't know. I don't kill things. I look at little bugs, and it's just the way my mind works. There is life there. I don't know what life is. I don't know whether it's a series of electrical impulses, chemical reactions, a combination. I have read scientific books, journals, and listened to people discuss it. But for myself, I don't really know what life is. So when you step on the smallest little living thing, what becomes of that tiny bit of life that was there? Does whatever it was cease to be when the physical body or container of it was annihilated? Was it so interwoven with the material part that when the material was gone, the life was gone with it? Because there's only really one, not a dichotomy, not two things, not like God took some dirt, put it with some water, molded a figure, Adam, and leaned him against the fence post until he dried out and became a man, then breathed into his nostrils, and he became a living soul. Those are stories that people tell. Here's the point that I'm getting to. We develop our own philosophy of life. Some people hear the term philosophy and think it means something deep. It's just a word that encompasses your view of the world. It may be accurate, it may not be. There are people who could discuss quantum physics, and it would seem like they're talking a foreign language, even though the words they use are English. An interesting little thing, I don't even know what to call it, to consider, is if you were 10 feet from a wall and each minute you went half the distance from where you are to that? Is it possible that you would never, when you get down to the atomic level, reach that wall? Because you only go half the distance from where you are to where you want to go. Well, there are people who figure things out like that because they don't have anything else to do with their mind, but they might convert that theoretical consideration into something that exists in this world, like robots. But anyway, I'm going to talk about some of the things that I've done, and I'm going to read about some of these things. And some of the articles that I read, I hadn't even read before. So when I look at some of them, I say, well, he may have been a heck of a cat. So I'm gonna start with what I call an introduction. And they will span a period of time. This one happens to be dated April 4th, 2007. Chambers won't be matched. It appeared in the Seward County Independent, as I say, April 4th, 2007. 7 from 22 would be 15 years ago. Pick a great athlete, pick an accomplished writer, pick an effective lawmaker. Sometimes their names may be preceded with, quote, there will never be another one like, ... Call it a purist view, but it seems to me, and this is the reporter, his name was Ed Howard, who has gone on to where people go when they die. Sometimes, call it a purist view, but it seems to me that no one has exceeded the accomplishments of Babe Ruth on the baseball field. Players that had more at-bats, more games in which to play, more games in a single season, whatever, did not best George Herman Ruth. There might be another one like the Babe someday. The best life lesson to come out of politics is undoubtedly, quote, never say never, unquote. And isn't it something? Because when they say never say never, they have said the word twice. Going on. But no one has yet done what the Babe did across the board. Sometimes the observation that there will never be another like so-and-so is followed by, quote, and thank goodness, unquote. The giving of such thanks mostly originates with those who suffered as a result of the extraordinary abilities of the person in question. Senator Ernie Chambers of Omaha falls into both categories. For once, it might be safe to say, quote, there will never be another like him, unquote. That there cannot be another Nebraska legislator entirely like Chambers is a virtual certainty. Now in his 37th year as a lawmaker, voter-imposed term limits will deny anyone else the tenure enjoyed by Chambers. No one will again see his number of legislative at-bats. Equally important, however, is the fact that his successors are unlikely to train for success in the Chambers style, even if they are fortunate enough to match his enormous gifts of mental ability and stamina. Much is often, then in parentheses, always question, much is often always said of Chambers' mastery of the rules of debate and procedure, the subsequent power to manipulate floor action, his offering of uncounted amendments to slow things down is legendary. What outsiders seldom understand is that writing those amendments and then presenting them require specific and substantial talents. You cannot write an amendment to a bill you don't understand, especially not on the spur of the moment. You have to learn what it does before you can propose that it do something else. Even if a proposed amendment is a piddling thing, like changing a date, the author still has to be able to stand up and talk for however many minutes, easier thought about than accomplished. The key to Chambers's effectiveness is not a secret. It is akin to a principle as simple as the Boy Scout motto, be prepared. Chambers, even more than other legendary lawmakers with whom he served, modified that credo to something like, be prepared every minute of every day. Do it by constantly preparing, unquote. Many will say it is for the better. Some will say it is for the worse. But the fact is that whether the times, the rules, and or the people have changed, there is not going to be another Ernie Chambers. Ernie and the Babe will have had some things in common, a lot of homers, a lot of strikeouts, admirers, detractors. But at this writing, there is no reason to believe that the full scope of either's accomplishments will be duplicated. Continuing. Now that was written in 2007. This was written almost exactly a year later, March 31st of 2008. This was in the Lincoln Journal-Star. Clock ticking on Chambers. Day 50 of the 2008 legislature. 11 more legislative days for Ernie. And when the legislature meets again in 2009, there will be an enormous void. Lots of time ahead to try to assess the legislative career of Ernie Chambers and his impact on the state. No doubt a number of journalists, scholars, and students will attempt to do that. But let's start with a few random observations as the clock ticks down on the most famous member of the legislature. In the beginning, not way back when God created the earth. That shows that everything is relative. The word can be the same, but it has a different meaning because there is a different context in which it is used. So if you meant cosmologically, in the beginning, you might be talking about the beginning of everything that is, if there was such a time, and a point when there was nothing. Or as he would say, this writer of the legislative career. But anyway, in the beginning, Chambers was viewed with some fear and trepidation, approached warily, if at all. Later, as his talents became obvious, it was suggested he could accomplish more if he were less challenging and more accommodating. Go along to get along. Be more like us, talking about the white people, because there were 47 of them, one of me, and they needed help. Tone it down. No, Chambers did not want to be like his colleagues, and he would not be co-opted. He would confront and challenge them, and there would be no way to ignore or marginalize him because he would marshal his intellect and energy and rhetorical skills. And he would master their rules and make them confront topics and issues and unpleasantries and words that would make them very uncomfortable. And sometimes he would deal in excess and make them wince and squirm. In confronting them, he has confronted all of us about racism and the legitimacy or hypocrisy of our religious faith. Do our lives reflect our professed and often piously stated beliefs or faith? Is it real or is it rote? Yikes. There's much more to the Chamber's legacy than any list of legislative achievements, which ought to include laws prevented as well as improved or enacted. By the way, the writer of this article is Don Walton, and he still writes for the Lincoln Journal, which now is a part of a consortium, not that really, but a conglomeration, which is run by one company that owns newspapers all over Nebraska and throughout this part of the country. When people ask me about a legacy, I tell them that word means nothing to me. It's too high on the anatomy. I don't even have a foot of C. I don't have an ankle of C. I don't even have a soul of C. So don't talk to me about a legacy. Let's talk about now. What's happening now? And other people are going to say what they want to say anyway, just as while you're alive, they say what they want to say. So their words are only sounds. They mean nothing to me. Words can kill, words can wound if the speaker knows how to use them. And that is metaphorically, meaning that it does not literally result in a person's death or wounding, maybe feelings. But when you know how to use words and you understand to some extent how people think, you begin to realize that a lot of things that are considered figures of speech or accepted laws or rules of this or that are really expressing the opposite of what they're talking about. You've heard the term self-conscious. Well, no, you're not really self-conscious. You're other people conscious. You are aware of other people, what they might be thinking, how they might be judging, but they call it self-conscious. So that statement means something. And generally in a society where language is used, people have a generalized understanding of what the meaning is, but they misunderstand more than what they understand because they never got it right in the first place. Nothing from nothing leaves nothing. You gotta have something if you want to be with me. One thing you know about me, I cannot sing. I've been called sometimes the burglar of music because I break into song. But let me continue. Including that legacy topics and issues and wrongs that would not have been discussed, views that would not have been aired. Ernie changed perceptions, forced confrontations, opened eyes, and sometimes minds. He shone a light in the dark corners where we do not go. He challenged the state and its legislators and its citizens to face the reality of our imperfections, pretensions, often mean and hateful stereotypes, our injustices, our less than benign neglect, and the fact that racism and prejudice and poverty and inherited or sometimes purchased privilege are real, and that we ought to do something about it. If we're fortunate, he will continue to challenge and confront and discomfort us in a new role. Maybe so, maybe not. Maybe what I'm doing now is what that writer had in mind, but I'm not a mind reader. That was in 2007. Can we go forward 13 years to 2020? And that's when the end for me, as far as being a legislator, is in view. This is dated December 27th, 2020. Big headline, Chambers leaves mark on Nebraska. Remember, this is the black man, the other, the inferior one, the one who's supposed to grin when nothing's funny, who won't make eye contact with white people, who, as we used to say, has a pocket full of sand, takes it out when he's approaching boss and throws it on the floor and shuffles in and say, "Pardon me, boss, I just graduated from the school," all such things as that. You see the clowns on television, the clownish roles they put us in. They never got that from me. I probably have a keener sense of humor than anybody on the face of the earth today. How do we know that's not true? How do we know that it is true? All we can do is speculate. When you want to get from the position of unknown to the known, you could first theorize. That means you put things together and say, if A plus B exists and they're this close to each other, they will produce something else which we will call C. So you theorize, then you hypothesize. The theory is where you just vague up here, and then as you begin to put a few things together, then you come up with a hypothesis or a mental image or picture. And then after you hypothesize, then you begin to try to realize, make it a reality, set up rules and principles, which if your theory and your hypothesis are correct, then when you start at point A, when you get to point B, something should be there that you didn't know about. But mentally and intellectually, you figure that that's the way it's going to be. For example, you may not have ever put your head down and run as fast as you could and smashed into a stone wall. But even though you haven't done it, you have a pretty good idea of what will happen if you do it. So that's not just a theory. It's not just a hypothesis. It's something that you know. Then there's something called extrapolation, where you have a few things, a few items, a few concepts and precepts, and from those, you draw a broader conclusion. So there are words that convey thoughts and ideas. If you learn words and master words, there are things you can do. You can control people's conduct. You can control their minds. Now, I never hit anybody in the mouth. I never cut anybody. On the floor of the legislature, I certainly never did anything to hurt anybody physically. So why did they fear me? That's for them to know. And they may not know why, but it had something to do with not wanting to be embarrassed or made a fool of, which means expose them for what they really are. I've never been afraid of white people. I'm not afraid of anybody, but I'm not crazy. As I often say as an example, I could be talking like this now, only faster, and be so caught up in what I'm saying, I'm not even aware that somebody's walked into the room. But if there is somebody and he put a pistol to my head and said, Chambers, if you say another word, it's curtains, I'm gonna blow you up. I'm gonna blow you away. Silent night, because I'm not crazy. But anyway, let me go back to this. In 2020, Chambers leaves mark on Nebraska. These kind of things have been said about nobody who's been in the legislature before. And sometimes the writers will admit it. This is from the Journal Star editorial board. A good share of Nebraskans have no clue who their state senator might be, but almost everyone knows Ernie. I'm one of those people who is known by one name, like Plato, Aristotle, Socrates, Einstein, Frankenstein. You get the picture. Everyone knows Ernie. That would be Ernie Chambers, the longest serving and arguably most influential senator in Nebraska history. Now, this is the editorial board of a newspaper, probably the second largest newspaper in Nebraska, saying things and admitting things that Black people are unaware of because they didn't watch what I did. They didn't listen to what I said. They knew that if they had a problem, they could bring it to me, and if I could, I'd help them. And they knew that I was condemned by white people, criticized by ministers and others. But like Old Man River, I just kept rolling along. Anyway, the longest serving and arguably most influential senator in Nebraska history. Think of all the white men and women who lived before I did, lived while I'm living, but I was more influential than any and all of them. But I don't have the big head. You know why? Because these are people expressing an opinion. If I was hungry before I read this, I'm still hungry. It's not food. If I was thirsty, I still want some water. So I take things, as they say, with a grain of salt. It's nice that they make acknowledgement, but did they treat me in the way that they ought to have. That's what things boil down to where I'm concerned. Don't compliment me. Don't praise me. I think it was Bob Dylan who wrote a song, Forever Young. May the good Lord be with you whenever you're far from home. May sunshine and happiness follow you wherever you may roam, or something like that. I can't remember all the words, but I like it. A guy named Rod Stewart sings it. Here we go, continuing. Controversial and given to lobbing verbal bombs at those he opposes, from the Catholic Church to abusive law enforcement to other politicians, Chambers has, since his 1970 election to represent Omaha's 11th district, been a tireless champion for the poor, people of color, those in prison and jails, the LGBTQ community, and others, rural and urban, who don't have a voice in government. They know what I've done. They know what I was doing. Now that the curtain is to be drawn down or dropped, they can admit and acknowledge some things. I received some of the harshest criticism and invalid criticism from the same Lincoln Journal-Star editorial board. But now that I'm no longer a threat, they can make admissions instead of allegations, accusations, and so forth. Let me read these things instead of all this commentary. I said I'm going to read what others had to say. Chambers' greatest triumph came in 2015 when the legislature voted 32-15 to abolish the death penalty, then overrode Governor Pete Ricketts' veto of the measure that Chambers had repeatedly introduced for decades. Sadly, the repeal was overturned by voters in 2016. Doesn't that show you how temporary and transitory things are? Even those things that we may have given our life up to that point to trying to accomplish can be taken away like that. And it often happens that way. But you don't give up, you don't quit, you don't drop and blow away. At least I don't. He was also the first to envision paying student athletes. His 1988 bill to provide a stipend to Nebraska football players was vetoed by Governor Kay Orr. In the 1990s, he took an AIDS test to stand up for the LGBTQ community and diminish the stigma. And in the 2000s, he shepherded the breakup of Omaha Public Schools, arguing the district had failed minority and poor children. If I were a part of speech, I would be an action verb. Continuing. But his legislative interests extended across the state, from saving prairie dogs and mountain lions to respecting private property rights. When they wanted to build that pipeline, I was one of those people in Western Nebraska came to. And people out there didn't think much of me at all because they're the same ones who voted for term limits to get me out of office. But that's the way white people are. What have you done for me lately? Continuing. Chambers has drawn national attention for decades, called, quote, the angriest Black man in America, unquote, by one publication, cited for his national trend setting in a 1980 resolution that withdrew $25 million in state funds from investments in companies that had an interest in South Africa. And this year, he was praised for his successful fight to preserve Nebraska's splitting of its electoral votes by congressional district, and gave Joe Biden one electoral vote from Nebraska. But given that he has worked in a minority in the conservative, Republican-dominated legislature, Chambers' impact has been more in stopping bad bills, often by himself, through his use of the filibuster or simply wearing down his colleagues. Quote, I'm only one person, but one person in the rules can do a lot, he once said, and did. Perhaps the best measures of Chambers' effectiveness came in 2000 when voters approved term limits for senators to, in the view of many, get rid of Ernie. That worked in 2008, but after sitting out 4 years, Chambers returned to the chamber in 2012 for 8 more years. On January 6th, Chambers will become the first senator to be term limited twice, but he may not be done yet. The 83-year-old told the Journal Star that he might consider coming back, quote, if I believe that I could do something of value for the community that would send me down here. No, what I said is, first of all, if I'm still alive, if my mind is clear, and if there is something, and my health is good, and there's something I can do of value to the community, and they fit to send me back down here, then I'll consider it. But newspaper people cannot put the whole thing. They have to kind of boil it down. If he doesn't return, Chambers will nonetheless have done a lifetime of service for the voiceless, made life better for all Nebraskans, and made the state a more just place to live. There are people who don't believe that. But believing something doesn't make it so. Disbelieving it does not make it not so. All right, here are some things that happen. Enshrinement in the rules of the legislature. I'm the only one where that was done. This is from April 13th, 2011. And it's written about me being enshrined in the rules when I'm no longer in the legislature, because that was during the period when I was term limited. But get this, or as the youngsters say, dig this. The Speaker of the Nebraska legislature won approval for a rarely used power to ensure full and fair debate of 2 controversial issues this year, a move one state senator criticized as extreme. Measures to increase funds for highway construction and to change the Commission of Industrial Relations were both declared Speaker's major proposals under a vote by the legislature's executive board. That designation allows the Speaker of the legislature to allow more debate on controversial issues and head off filibusters and other parliamentary delaying tactics. Why would they do such a thing? Listen to what the white man admitted. The power was created in 1996 to overcome the filibustering tactics of then State Senator Ernie Chambers of Omaha. It has been used only 3 times in the past 6 years. Speaker Mike Flood, who recently came back to the legislature, then was elected to fill out the term of that Republican named Fortenberry, who was convicted of various crimes, and he had to resign from the House of Representatives. But anyway, Speaker Mike Flood of Norfolk said he sought to invoke the power to head off of filibustering on the roads proposal, Legislative Bill 84. Delaying tactics during first round debate on the bill prevented discussion of any substantive amendments, he said. Lincoln Senator Danielle Conrad, who had left the legislature, was the head of the ACLU, and this time around is seeking a return to the legislature. Anyway, she led efforts to stop LB 84 during first round debate. She called Flood's move an extreme remedy that dilutes the powers of individual senators and our constituents. Why did they do it? To try to stop Senator Chambers. And it became known as the Stop Chambers Rule. And here it is in brief. The Speaker shall be authorized to A, designate up to 5 bills or resolutions proposing to amend the Constitution as major proposals during each legislative session. Then he could determine the scheduling of the proposal and the order of amendments and motions to be considered. All of this changing of the rules to stop me, and it didn't work. But there I was, enshrined in the rules of the white people's legislature. Number 2, Roman numeral 2, enshrinement in the statutes of Nebraska. It's not enough for this uppity black man to make them change the rules of the legislature. He And what he has done is in the statute books of the state of Nebraska. Let me go on. I'm having fun. This is dated September 14th, 1992. In a paragraph from the Lincoln Journal, Chambers rewrote the system. The book on Senator Ernie Chambers' achievements in changing state laws has a plenitude of entries. Few, though, will exceed Chambers' successful championing of district elections against potent establishment resistance. Every entity I changed was resisted by those who were members of it and the powerful forces in the white community who backed them, but I overcame it all, including vetoes by the then governors. For all members of the Omaha City Council, the Omaha Board of Education, and the Douglas County Board, all were elected at large BC before Chambers. None are to be now. The journal's opinion remains that a combination at large and district mix is a better overall system for local jurisdictions. That was when I got legislation to require district elections for the city of Omaha. And naturally, it was challenged, and it was challenged by the guy named Fred Jacoberger, who had run the city council and been its president for years and years. He had a laundry, and he had a big image on the top of it. And this was supposedly a Black woman called Connie Maj. And she was bent over a tub and mechanically would move. And you could see yellow polka dots under things on her rear end as she washed by hand those clothes. So some people call Jacoberger wet wash. But this is just some of the things that the Supreme Court said when that bill was challenged. And again, it goes back to the way I legislated, the way I did my homework, the way I drafted legislation, the problems I anticipated, because I knew what the law was, I knew what the Constitution said, and I knew how I had to draft legislation to avoid violating the Constitution. This case was decided in 1982. And if there are any legal eagles out there, 878 Nebraska, 211. The city of Omaha is a city of the metropolitan class and is governed by a home rule charter, which was adopted in 1956. And the portion pertinent to the present action, this is from the court's opinion that I'm reading, provides, quote, the council shall be composed of 7 members who shall be known as councilmen. All 7 councilmen shall be elected by the people on an at-large, nonpartisan basis and shall serve for a term of years. 3 subsequent attempts to alter this provision by amendments, which would have allowed some form of representation and voting by district as opposed to at large, failed when put to a vote of the electors. So since the white people are not going to vote for district elections, so we as a community and a socioeconomic group could have representation on the board that governed us. I was in the legislature, so I was going to use the legislative platform to get something done. In 1979, Senator Chambers introduced LB 329, which was adopted by the legislature over the governor's veto, and similar bills, proposals have been vetoed several times. The pertinent portion thereof provides the election commissioner in any county in which is situated a city of the metropolitan class shall divide the city into 7 city council districts of compact and contiguous territory. Such districts shall be numbered consecutively from 1 to 7. 1 council member shall be elected from each such district. The court was reading my language. When the legislature enacts a law affecting municipal affairs, which is of a statewide concern, the state law takes precedence over any municipal action taken under the Home Rule Charter. When analyzing the issue of this nature, one is required to determine the concern of the legislative act prior to determining whether that concern is statewide or local. If it's considered local, then the local uh, charter governs. If it's statewide, then the state law overrules the charter. I knew that. I wrote the legislation to accommodate it. It is obvious from the legislative history of LB 329 and from the express language of the statute itself that the concern of the bill was to ensure adequate and equal representation to all socioeconomic segments of the populations of cities of the metropolitan class. The statute itself declares, in part, and this is my language, the legislature finds and declares that the election of the city council at large in cities of the metropolitan class denies representation to some socioeconomic segments of the population, unquote. Then the court goes on. Furthermore, at several points, Senator Chambers, the bill's introducer, noted that the purpose of LB 329 was to ensure, quote, proper proportionate representation, unquote. That's the value of what is called legislative history. I paid attention to it. The legislature then dealt with this concern over disproportionate representation in cities of the metropolitan class by requiring the election of council members by district instead of on an at-large basis. Therefore, although LB 329 did alter the method of electing city council members in metropolitan class cities, the legislature's true concern in enacting the bill was its fear that certain socioeconomic classes were being deprived of representation by elections on an at-large basis. The question then becomes whether this concern for proportionate representation is a matter of local or statewide concern. I knew that. So I wrote the legislation to take it into consideration. I discussed this at the committee hearing, and I discussed it on the floor of the legislature, and the court referred to that when they were ruling. So what I was doing was giving a guideline for the court to follow once the challenge came, and I knew it would. The legislature, meaning Senator Chambers, foresaw this problem and attempted to remedy the situation by declaring in part, quote, this is my language. The legislature further finds and declares that fair and adequate representation of all areas and all socioeconomic segments of the population of cities of the metropolitan class is a matter of general statewide concern. The provisions of any home rule charter notwithstanding. Omaha had a home rule charter. I was specifically erasing that. This is what I was doing. When people ask, what did you do? They don't read, they don't study. There are laws they're living under that are what they are because of me, but they don't know it. So it's a poor car that won't toot its own horn, I said. And I was going to take a little different approach today. In this instance, as we have noted, the judges, we are dealing with an act of the legislature whose primary concern, my concern, was to ensure proportionate representation to every socioeconomic segment of the population of a metropolitan class city. When confronted with an attack on a state legislative apportionment scheme and its potential impairment of the constitutionally protected right to vote, the U.S. Supreme Court noted that such a case with regard to the right of suffrage, quote, touches a sensitive and important area of human rights and involves one of the basic civil rights of man. Undoubtedly, the right of suffrage is a fundamental matter in a free and democratic society. So when the legislature, without me there, starts trying to interfere with our right to vote with various pieces of legislation or even amendments to the state constitution, there is a Supreme Court decision that people can refer to fight those things. I didn't just look at today. I looked at what might happen in the future, but I wrote legislation to deal with today. Consequently, we, the court, must consider this case as one in which the legislature acted in the interest of protecting a fundamental human and civil right, not just a legal right, but a human right, that which inheres in our very humanity. Similarly, we, the court, find in this instance that the legislature's actions to protect the fundamental civil rights of suffrage and proportionate representation are also of statewide concern as opposed to local concern. That's what I wrote. Consequently, the provisions of LB 329 supersede the provisions of the Omaha Home Rule Charter and do not violate the state constitution. While the action of the Nebraska legislature in this instance directly affects the manner by which a metropolitan city selects its city council, the primary concern, and they keep repeating it, of the legislation was to ensure the fundamental right to vote and the right to proportionate representation. Such matters are not a local concern alone, and they go well beyond the manner in which the election is conducted. And there are white people who've gotten on the city council who never could have gotten on without district elections. Nobody from South Omaha. My legislation helped everybody, the good, the bad, the ugly. White people, Black people, Native Americans, straight people, LGBTQ people, because my philosophy was that anything born of a man and a woman is my brother if it's a male, my sister if a female. And one way I would answer that question that Cain put to God in the Garden of Eden, am I my brother's keeper? For myself, to the extent possible. First of all, I proclaim every man born of a woman, every woman born of a woman are my brother and sister respectively. To the extent that I can, as a member of the legislature or otherwise, I am my brother's and my sister's keeper. And I did a good job of keeping, but people don't read. They don't know the laws that I put in place. They live under the laws. They benefit from those laws. But to them, I am an outlaw. I'm a bad fellow. In fact, I was so bad they changed the Constitution to get rid of me. And they hurt themselves. But here is the end. We, the court, conclude that a reasonable distinction does exist between metropolitan class cities under the commission form of government and all other metropolitan class cities, and that therefore LB 329 is not special or local legislation in violation of the Constitution, and therefore my bill requiring election by districts stands. And here's what a judge of the then Supreme Court wrote. In reviewing the legislative history of numerous statutes, I read and examine virtually all of your comments in committee and on the floor of the legislature. I must say that I agree with you on the merits of legislation about 85 to 90% of the time, but I understand your rationale and reasoning 100% of the time. Hopefully, individuals that read my judicial opinions understand my rationale and reasoning nearly 100% of the time, even if they may disagree with the result in a particular time. My time is up, and ending as I always do, when the canary was told that the door to the cage was ajar, I'm out of here.
Thank you for watching The Ernie Chambers Show. If you'd like to make suggestions, email us at ewcfacts@gmail.com. That's ewcfacts@gmail.com. This has been an EWC Communication production.